The hearing room was tense from the moment it began. Everyone knew sparks would fly, but no one could have predicted just how quickly things would unravel. On one side of the table sat Senator John Kennedy, a man known for his sharp tongue, his Southern wit, and his ability to cut through political noise with plain-spoken clarity. On the other side was Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC, as she is known to millions of supporters and critics alike. A rising star of the progressive left, with a reputation for passionate speeches and relentless questioning. Topic on the docket was supposedly routine oversight of government spending in a newly passed federal program. But like most routine hearings in Washington, it became anything but ordinary once AOC took the floor. With the cameras rolling and the press seated in the back, she launched into her remarks with fire, critiquing what she called wasteful spending and accusing opponents of prioritizing corporate interests over everyday citizens. Her words were sharp, and her energy was undeniable, as Kennedy leaned back in his chair. Listening, he knew exactly where this was heading. AOC had a style he had seen before: move fast, speak louder than anyone else in the room, and dominate the narrative. Her goal was clear: frame the debate before anyone else could even lay a foundation. And at first, it seemed to be working. Headlines were already being drafted in the minds of reporters scribbling notes, ready to write about her fiery takedown of conservative critics. But Kennedy was not an easy opponent. He didn't need to match her volume, and he didn't care about the theatrics. He had something far more dangerous than a loud voice. He had evidence. Real, tangible, undeniable documentation that would shift the entire conversation in an instant. And the irony was, AOC didn't even know it was coming. The exchange began when AOC, with her trademark directness, accused Kennedy and his colleagues of ignoring critical data. She cited numbers, referenced reports, and insisted that the facts were clear. But before Kennedy could respond, she cut in again, interrupting him, dismissing his attempts to clarify and doubling down on her critique. That was when the tension in the room became palpable. Spectators leaned forward, sensing the moment was about to turn. Kennedy's face remained calm, but those who knew him well recognized the subtle shift in his posture. He was preparing to strike not with insults, not with rhetoric, but with something that could not be spun away. When AOC interrupted him a third time, insisting he was ignoring the evidence, Kennedy simply paused, letting her words hang in the air. Silence filled the room. And then, in his measured Southern drawl, he uttered the line that would set the tone for the rest of the confrontation. "Congresswoman, I'm glad you brought up evidence, because I've got it right here." The words landed like a thunderclap. AOC, momentarily thrown off, froze mid-sentence. The room went still. Reporters looked up from their notepads. Staffers exchanged quick glances. And even the committee chair seemed unsure of what Kennedy was about to reveal. Kennedy slowly reached into his folder, pulling out a stack of papers. This wasn't bluster. This wasn't theater. These were documents, official records, data sets, and signed reports that directly contradicted the narrative AOC had been pushing. The stage was set. What had begun as a routine hearing was about to become a headline-grabbing showdown. And in that moment, everyone realized the balance of power in the room had shifted. Kennedy wasn't just responding to her interruption. He was about to dismantle her argument, piece by piece, with the very evidence she claimed he didn't have. The air in the committee chamber felt heavy as Kennedy placed the papers on the desk in front of him. No rush, no panic, just deliberate movements that carried their own kind of weight. Everyone understood what was happening, though no one knew exactly what those papers contained. The anticipation was as thick as the silence. AOC never won to back down, tried to regain control of the moment. She leaned forward, her voice cutting across the silence like a blade. "Senator, with all due respect, I've reviewed the reports, and none of what you're suggesting aligns with the actual findings. If you have something, then show it. Otherwise, we should stick to the facts already on the record." Kennedy gave a faint smile, the kind that wasn't born of arrogance but of certainty. Wasn't bluffing. His hand rested on the stack of documents, as if to signal that he was more than ready to accept her challenge. But instead of answering immediately, he took his time. He adjusted his glasses, glanced briefly at the chair of the committee, and then looked back at AOC with that calm Southern composure that often made his words cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. "Congresswoman," he said slowly, "you and I both know this isn't about volume. It's about truth. Truth doesn't care how passionately you present. It only cares about whether it can be proven." Those words landed hard. In a city built on rhetoric, Kennedy was cutting right to the bone. The camera zoomed in, catching AOC's expression shift ever so slightly, not defeat, but irritation at being cornered so quickly. She tried again to interrupt, but this time Kennedy didn't stop. He opened the first page of his documents, flipping it toward the microphone so the staffers and stenographers could clearly follow along. "Here's the first piece," he said firmly. "This is the financial breakdown from the very department you just cited. Page 12, Section 4, where it states, in black and white, that funding allocations were not only misrepresented in your remarks, but also adjusted before implementation. The very claim you made a moment ago that resources were funneled into corporate subsidies at the expense of public programs is flatly contradicted here." Gasps whispered across the room. Some reporters leaned forward, scribbling furiously. Others simply stared, realizing they were watching a political trap spring shut. AOC attempted to counter, insisting the report Kennedy cited was selective, that there were other documents that painted a different picture. But before she could gain traction, Kennedy lifted another page. His timing was surgical, as though he had anticipated each of her objections long before she voiced them. "Congresswoman, I anticipated that point as well," he said, his drawl calm but unyielding, "which is why I also requested supplemental data. Page 23. Appendix B. This is not my interpretation, it's the government's own audit. And it says word for word that the concerns about favoritism toward corporations were investigated and found to be unfounded." Words "unfounded" echoed in the chamber. It was the kind of word that reporters loved to seize upon because it told the story in a single beat. AOC leaned back in her chair, her jaw tightening. She wasn't defeated. Not yet. Her brand was built on persistence, on turning the fight back to her advantage no matter how cornered she looked. But for the first time in the hearing, the momentum wasn't hers. Kennedy had done something rare in Washington. He had shifted the narrative with nothing but facts, delivered methodically and without theatrics. The audience knew it. The chair knew it, and most importantly, AOC knew it. The hearing wasn't just a clash of personalities anymore. It was turning into a test of credibility, as Kennedy had just taken the upper hand. The moment Kennedy finished reading from the government audit, the atmosphere in the hearing shifted like a pendulum. Reporters exchanged quick looks. Staffers typed furiously into their laptops, and the faint buzz of whispered side conversations grew louder in the background. Kennedy's voice had landed. But AOC was not the type to surrender the floor without a counterstrike. She leaned forward, her pen tapping against the desk, her eyes fixed sharply on the senator. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her tone clipped and forceful, "you're presenting this as if one report, written under questionable oversight, tells the entire story. That's not how facts work. The truth isn't cherry-picked from an appendix. It's built from the lived experiences of millions of Americans who know these programs aren't reaching them. So forgive me if I don't take a single audit as gospel." Her words had power. She framed herself as speaking for the people, contrasting Kennedy's reliance on paper records with the voices of those who felt unheard. It was a strategy she had perfected: shift the fight from documents to emotions, from numbers to narratives. For a moment, it resonated. A few murmurs of agreement rippled from her allies seated behind her, but Kennedy didn't flinch. He waited for her to finish, then placed his glasses down on the desk, folding them carefully before responding. His calm, deliberate manner stood in sharp contrast to her urgency. "Congresswoman, I don't doubt the sincerity of the people you claim to represent. What I do doubt," he said evenly, "is the accuracy of your accusations. There's a difference between anecdotes and evidence. If we're going to spend billions of taxpayer dollars, we can't do it based on who has. the loudest story. We have to rely on facts." The statement cut through the room. Kennedy's refusal to engage on emotional grounds left AOC with a dilemma: continue pressing on narrative, or attempt to discredit the documents themselves. She chose both. "That's a clever line, Senator," she shot back. "But these so-called facts often come from agencies already captured by corporate influence. Audits can be massaged, data can be framed, and entire reports can be written to downplay what communities are really experiencing. You hold up these pages as if they're sacred text, but we've seen time and again how institutions protect themselves instead of the people they're supposed to serve." Her words drew nods from a few colleagues, and the cameras zoomed in again. She was fighting not just Kennedy, but also for the soundbite that would survive long after the hearing ended. But Kennedy, far from rattled, leaned into his microphone. "Well, Congresswoman," he said, his voice steady, "if the agencies are lying, then it is our duty to expose it. But if the agencies are telling the truth, it is our duty to accept it. What I've laid out here isn't interpretation. Documentation. If you believe the auditors falsified records, then I'd suggest we bring them here under oath and ask them ourselves. But until then, dismissing facts simply because they don't fit your narrative isn't oversight. It's theater." That word theater hung heavy in the air. The implication was unmistakable. Kennedy was suggesting that AOC's fiery performance was more about headlines than governance. The jab stung, and even AOC's sharp composure wavered for just a moment. The hearing chair banged the gavel lightly, urging both members to maintain order, but the damage had been done. Kennedy's use of the word had reframed the battle. No longer was it simply a disagreement over data. It was now a contest over credibility. Was AOC exposing injustice, or was she performing for the cameras? Was Kennedy hiding behind paperwork, or was he the lone defender of objective truth? The clash had grown beyond policy. It was now a duel for trust in front of a national audience. Kennedy's quiet, calculated delivery was forcing everyone in the room to ask the question, AOC. Least wanted raised, what if she was wrong? The word theater echoed in AOC's ears long after Kennedy said it. It was the kind of accusation she despised because it cut at the heart of her political identity. For years, she had been branded by critics as someone who thrived on spectacle, who cared more about viral clips than substantive legislation. And now, in a hearing that was supposed to showcase her passion for oversight, Kennedy had thrown that exact label at her in front of the nation. She wasn't going to let it stick. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice rising now, "it's not theater to demand accountability. It's not theater to ask why families in the Bronx are struggling to pay rent while billion-dollar corporations get tax breaks. What is theater, Senator? Is hiding behind papers and pretending that bureaucratic language equals justice? Real. People don't live in appendices and audits, they live in neighborhoods crushed by policies you defend." Her words rang out, fiery and unapologetic. A few spectators even nodded, feeling the force of her rhetoric. She was doing what she did best, channeling it frustration into a narrative that made her appear as the voice of ordinary Americans against entrenched power. But Kennedy didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, the calm in his posture amplifying the contrast. When he spoke, his tone was even lower than before, almost quiet, forcing listeners to lean in. "Congresswoman," he said softly, "justice is not measured by how loud you say it. It's measured by whether what you say is true." Stillness in his delivery landed harder than if he had raised his voice. It was surgical. He didn't just counter her argument. He undermined her entire style of debate. AOC leaned forward. "Cutting him off again? Truth is not something you can cherry-pick, Senator. You don't get to wave around reports that ignore lived reality and then tell me I'm the one being dishonest. That's not truth, that's politics dressed up as evidence." Kennedy finally picked up the stack of papers again, flipping through with meticulous precision. His movements were deliberate, calculated to show he wasn't scrambling. He was prepared. "You keep calling this cherry-picking," he said, his drawl steady. "But every page I've read comes from your own agencies, the very institutions that oversee these programs. If you're saying they lied, then you're not accusing me, you're accusing them. If that's the case, then let's subpoena the officials who signed their names on these reports. Let's put them under oath and see if they stand by their findings. Will you support that, Congresswoman? The challenge landed like a hammer. AOC blinked, caught between two risky responses. If she agreed, she risked validating Kennedy's evidence by allowing those officials to defend it. She refused. She risked appearing like she didn't actually want the truth, only the soundbite. Her jaw tightened. She tried to pivot. What I will support, she said, her voice clipped, is an investigation that looks beyond the sanitized language of bureaucrats and asks real people what's happening on the ground. Because those voices matter just as much as the reports you're clutching. Kennedy tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. What if those voices disagree with the reports? Do we ignore the evidence then? Do we make policy by anecdote instead? A fact that may win headlines, Congresswoman, but it doesn't solve problems. The line drew murmurs again. AOC opened her mouth to push back, but this time the gavel from the committee chair cut her off. Order, the chair said firmly. Let's allow one member to finish before another begins. For the first time, the interruption wasn't from Kennedy, it was from authority itself. The optics weren't good. The audience could see that Kennedy wasn't just holding the evidence, he was controlling the rhythm of the entire exchange. AOC's interruptions, once her weapon, were beginning to look like desperation. And Kennedy, calm and unflappable, was about to press that advantage even harder. The chamber had grown restless. Reporters knew they were witnessing more than just a heated exchange. This was the kind of moment that could dominate the news cycle for days. AOC's fiery interruptions had carried her far in past hearings. But Kennedy's steady control was cutting through the noise like a scalpel. And then came the moment no one expected. Kennedy stopped sparring and went straight for the heart of the matter. He lifted a single folder from the stack in front of him. Unlike the previous reports, this one was thinner, marked with a bright red tab. He held it carefully, as though it carried more weight than the others. A hush fell over the room. Everyone sensed something was coming. Congresswoman Kennedy began, his voice as calm as ever. You've accused this committee of ignoring evidence. You've accused me personally of cherry-picking facts to fit a narrative. Well, I'd like to introduce a document that was released only last month. I suspect you haven't seen it, or perhaps you have, and simply chose not to mention it. AOC shifted slightly in her chair, her eyes narrowing. She tried to cut in with a quick rebuttal, but the chair immediately tapped the gavel. The senator has the floor, the chair reminded. Kennedy had the moment all to himself. This, Kennedy continued, holding the folder up for all to see, is an internal memorandum from the Inspector General's office. It's not a political report. It's not a talking point. It's an independent review. And it states, very clearly, that the very claims you've made today about corporate favoritism were investigated and found to be not only unsubstantiated, but based on data that was, quote, misrepresented by advocacy groups for political purposes. The room erupted into a low murmur. Reporters scrambled to jot down the quote. Staffers leaned across their desks to whisper, and even the chair looked momentarily startled. The words misrepresented by advocacy groups for political purposes carried explosive weight. Kennedy didn't stop there. He opened the folder, reading directly from the text. Page 4. The assertion that funds were redirected in disproportionate amounts to corporate entities at the expense of public initiatives is inaccurate. Records show that 87% of funding was allocated to public programs, with only 13% directed toward private partnerships were selected through a transparent bidding process overseen by multiple agencies. He closed the folder slowly, letting the words settle in the room like dust after an explosion. Then, with perfect timing, he added, Congresswoman, I don't mind a debate, but what I will not sit quietly for is an accusation that I ignore evidence. When it's clear the evidence ignored was on your side of the table, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Even AOC's allies on the committee shifted uncomfortably. The cameras captured every angle. Kennedy's steady confidence, AOC's pursed lips, the reporter's wide eyes. Finally, AOC leaned forward, trying to reclaim ground. Senator, let's be honest. Inspectors General are not immune from political influence. We've seen reviews softened before, language watered down to protect agencies. You can read from that folder all you like, but I'm not going to let one memo erase the testimony of families who've lived through the failures of these programs. It was a strong counterpunch, but it didn't land with the same force. Kennedy had shown something tangible, something undeniable. While AOC was still fighting on abstract ground, Kennedy responded with another quiet strike, and I respect those families, Congresswoman. But their voices deserve solutions, not slogans. If you want to fight for them, you ought to start with facts. Otherwise, you're not helping them, you're using them. That last line cracked through the chamber like lightning. Gasps rippled through the audience. The chair called for order again, but the damage was done. Kennedy had dropped his bombshell, and AOC, for the first time in the exchange, seemed to falter under the weight of it. The hearing had officially turned. Kennedy now owned the room. For a few moments, the hearing chamber belonged entirely to Kennedy. His calm unveiling of the Inspector General's memorandum had landed like a blow no one saw coming. The murmurs, the shifting seats, the quick movements of reporters scribbling on notepads, all of it suggested the momentum was in his hands. But AOC had built her career on resilience, on taking punches that looked like knockouts and turning them into opportunities. She wasn't finished. She straightened in her chair, exhaled sharply, and leaned into her microphone with renewed fire. Senator Kennedy, what you've just read proves my point more than it disproves it. You want to hold up an Inspector General's memo like it's the holy grail of truth. But anyone who has studied these oversight offices knows how they work. They rely on what agencies themselves provide. And when those agencies have every incentive to hide mistakes, the so-called independent review becomes little more than recycled talking points. If you think waving that folder erases what communities are actually living through, then you're not defending truths, you're defending bureaucracy. Her words carried sharpness, and this time she didn't wait for Kennedy to respond. She pressed on, her rhythm quickening, her eyes locking directly onto him. Because here's what I know. In the Bronx, I've spoken to mothers who've waited months for assistance that was promised. I've seen businesses shutter while so-called partnership funds went to corporations with entire teams of lawyers to exploit loopholes. That memo you're holding doesn't capture that reality. And no audit, no report, no retabbed. A folder will ever reflect the human cost of policies designed to look good on paper while failing in practice. The room stirred again. Some spectators clapped softly before the chair rapped the gavel to restore order. AOC had found her footing, turning Kennedy's evidence into a symbol of detachment from real life. To her supporters, she wasn't backing down, she was doubling down. Kennedy, however, showed no sign of fluster. He let her words hang, then leaned forward, his hands folded neatly on the desk. Congresswoman, he said with deliberate calm, I don't question the pain of the people you describe. I question the accuracy of the story you're telling about why they're in pain. If we make decisions based solely on anecdotes, we will design policies that feel good in a speech, but collapse in reality. You want to fix the Bronx? I want that. Too, but to do it, we need more than passion. We need precision, and precision comes from evidence, not emotion. The contrast was stark, her voice rising, his voice steady. She carried energy, he carried weight. AOC tried again, pushing harder. Evidence without accountability is meaningless. You can drown this room in paperwork, but when it's the same system marking its own homework, it doesn't prove justice. It hides injustice. That's what you're defending, Senator. You're defending a broken system because it gives you numbers to hide behind. The accusation drew a collective gasp. It was bold, almost reckless, but it resonated with some in the chamber who distrusted Washington's institutions. Kennedy raised an eyebrow, his voice sharpening just slightly. Then let's be clear, Congresswoman. If you are accusing the Inspector General of lying, then say it plainly. Don't dance around it. Don't accuse me of hiding behind paperwork. If the IG falsified this report, then make that charge here and now, under oath, on the record. The challenge froze the room. It was a trap, a dangerous one. She confirmed she'd ignite a storm of political and legal consequences. If she denied, she'd undercut her own argument. For the first time, AOC hesitated. And in Washington, even a few seconds of silence could feel like an eternity. Kennedy had pushed her into the corner. Again, the silence after Kennedy's challenge was electric. For a few seconds, it felt as though the entire hearing had stopped breathing. Kennedy had cornered AOC with a simple, devastating question. Was she accusing the Inspector General of lying? Any direct answer would carry consequences, she said. Yes, she would open herself to accusations of attacking a watchdog office that even progressives often defended. If she said no, she would weaken her fiery case against the evidence Kennedy had just dropped on the table. AOC's mind worked quickly. She knew she couldn't let Kennedy frame her as reckless or evasive. She needed a pivot, a way to climb out of the trap and redirect the focus back onto him. She leaned forward again, her tone shifting, not angry this time, but passionate, reflective, and almost pleading. Senator Kennedy, I'm not here to play a game of gotcha with inspectors or auditors. I respect the institution of oversight, but oversight that ignores systemic flaws is incomplete oversight. So no, not saying the Inspector General lied. What I am saying is that their report is limited by the information they're given. And the information they're given comes from agencies that have every reason to protect themselves. If we want truth, we can't stop at surface-level audits. We need deeper investigations, real transparency, and voices from the communities who live this every day. It was a skillful pivot, dodging the trap while reframing the conversation as a moral issue. Instead of looking cornered, she projected urgency. Her allies behind her nodded visibly, signaling that she had regained some ground. Kennedy, however, wasn't about to let her slip away. He adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable, and replied in his deliberate cadence. Congresswoman, with all due respect, you've just described every oversight mechanism in government. No system is perfect. No audit is infinite. But until we have reason to believe otherwise, we rely on these institutions. We can't just disregard their findings because they don't align with your position. That isn't oversight. That's ideology. Ripple went through the chamber again. Kennedy was striking at her credibility, suggesting her fight wasn't about truth, but about political convenience. AOC raised her hand slightly, signaling she wasn't finished. And yet, Senator, history is full of examples where those same institutions failed the American people, where audits looked clean on paper but communities suffered in silence. Flint, Michigan didn't appear in glossy reports until children were poisoned. Corporate bailouts looked justified until workers lost their jobs. I will never apologize for demanding more than what a tidy appendix tells me. If that makes me ideological, then so be it. But at least my ideology is rooted in people, not paperwork. That landed powerfully with the audience. It was the emotional high ground, tying her argument to real crises where institutions had indeed failed. Reporters scribbled frantically. This was the kind of rhetoric that would end up in headlines. Kennedy, though, didn't waver. His reply was as sharp as it was understated. Those examples are exactly why we strengthen oversight, not discard it. I don't disagree that institutions fail, Congresswoman. What I disagree with is the idea that passion alone can replace proof. Because if all we need is outrage, then anyone with a microphone can dictate policy. That may feel good in the short term, but it will ruin lives in the long term. The contrast was striking again, AOC appealing to history and human suffering. Kennedy anchoring everything back to structure and facts. Two different languages, two different audiences. Colliding in real time, the chair rapped the gavel again, urging both sides to keep their remarks within time. But the tension was undeniable. AOC had avoided Kennedy's trap, yet Kennedy had managed to keep her pinned to the defensive ground. It was becoming more than just a debate. It was a philosophical duel about what counted as truth in politics, and both of them knew the fight was far from over. The committee chamber felt like a pressure cooker. The longer the back and forth stretched, the more the tension thickened. By now, it wasn't just about a memo, an audit, or a report. It was about credibility, reputation, and who would walk out of that room with the upper hand. AOC could feel it. Kennedy's calm, steady delivery was painting her as reactive, even reckless, in contrast. She knew she had to break that rhythm to show that his slow, deliberate style wasn't wisdom, but concealment. She leaned forward, her voice rising with conviction. "Senator Kennedy, you talk about passion as if it's the enemy of truth. But the truth is, without passion, none of us would be sitting in this chamber. Without passion, people would have stayed silent while injustice thrived. You hold up your folders and your reports, but let's not pretend paper fixes problems. What fixes problems is listening to people, fighting for people, and refusing to accept bureaucratic answers when human lives are at stake." Her words rang with force, filling the chamber with echoes. The cameras zoomed in, her intensity made for gripping television. To her base, this was the AOC they admired, unflinching, emotional, uncompromising. Kennedy, however, didn't blink. He leaned slightly toward his microphone, his tone steady, almost weary, as though speaking to a student who still didn't grasp the lesson. "Congresswoman, passion has its place. But passion without discipline is chaos. You want to fight for people? So do I, but fighting for people means giving them solutions that work, not speeches that stir. And if you dismiss every inconvenient fact as bureaucracy, then what you're offering isn't oversight. It's theater." That word again, theater, a deliberate echo, dropped like a hammer. It brought the murmurs back to life across the room. AOC shot back immediately, her voice sharper, almost breaking into a shout. "What's theater, Senator? Is pretending your stack of papers gives you the moral high ground. What's theater is waving around reports written in offices thousands of miles away, while ignoring the testimony of communities who are actually living with these failures. Do you think mothers in the Bronx care about your appendices? Do you think workers losing jobs want to hear about your page numbers? No, they want accountability. They want change." The eruption in her tone electrified the room. The gavel struck. Once, then twice. But her words had already landed. Her supporters behind her sat taller, some nodding, others whispering encouragement. Kennedy waited, letting her energy burn in the silence she left behind. Then he spoke again, quiet but cutting. "I don't doubt their pain, Congresswoman. I doubt your prescription. Because pain without accuracy leads to false cures. You can't treat an illness if you misdiagnose it. And what you've offered here today is not a cure, it's a performance." The clash had peaked. The chamber buzzed with energy as the two most polarizing figures of the day locked horns in full view of the nation. AOC's passion had reached its height. Kennedy's calm had sharpened into surgical precision. And together, they created a collision of styles that reporters would replay for weeks. The chair banged the gavel again, louder this time. "Order. Order," the voice rang out. Both sides were instructed to yield for the next round of questioning, but everyone in the room knew what they had just seen. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a showdown, raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable. And while the gavel ended the exchange for the moment, the story was far from over. The battle lines were drawn more clearly than ever. The gavel strikes finally brought a pause to the fiery back and forth. For the first time in nearly an hour, neither Kennedy nor AOC had the microphone. The chair's firm voice echoed in the chamber. "We will move to the next member for questioning." On the surface, the clash was over. But in reality, the fallout had only just begun. Around the dais, lawmakers shifted in their seats, some visibly uneasy, others eager to seize the spotlight. The spectacle they had just witnessed wasn't an ordinary disagreement. It was a full-blown collision of political philosophies. And the ripple effects were immediate. Reporters in the press section were already leaning toward one another, whispering predictions about how the headlines would frame the moment. Some scribbled phrases like "Kennedy calls AOC's case theater," or "AOC. Passion is not the enemy of truth." They knew both sides had left the hearing, with sound bites that would race across television screens and social media within hours. On the Democratic side of the dais, a few allies of AOC exchanged nods of support, clearly ready to echo her line of argument when their turns came. To them, Kennedy's reliance on reports and audits looked cold, disconnected from human suffering. They saw AOC as the fighter willing to challenge stale institutions, even if it meant clashing head-on with a seasoned senator. Meanwhile, Republicans quietly smiled among themselves, some scribbling notes to ensure they referenced Kennedy's theater remark when their time arrived. To them, the exchange was a gift. AOC had looked aggressive, interrupting, nearly shouting, while Kennedy appeared calm, collected, and armed with evidence. It was the contrast they had long sought to highlight, and in the audience the divide was just as sharp. Supporters of AOC muttered about Kennedy's condescension, accusing him of dismissing lived experience as noise. Supporters of Kennedy shook their heads at AOC's interruptions, saying she proved his point every time she cut him off. Damn. The hearing had become less about policy and more about perception, and perception was the coin of the realm in Washington. Kennedy himself sat back in his chair, flipping through the pages of his folder once more, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. His demeanor radiated the calm of a man who felt he had already made his case. He wasn't chasing the cameras, he knew they would chase him, AOC. Meanwhile, scribbled notes furiously in the margins of her binder. Her eyes darted between Kennedy and the audience, a signal that she was already preparing her counterpunch, not for the committee, but for the cameras outside. She understood. The hearing room was just one stage. The real fight would play out in the press conferences, interviews, and viral clips that followed. When the next lawmaker began questioning a witness, much of the audience wasn't listening. The electricity in the air had already peaked. Came next felt like background noise compared to the clash they had just witnessed. Even the witnesses themselves glanced at Kennedy and AOC, aware that their prepared statements were no longer the main event by the time the session adjourned. For a recess, the hallway outside was already packed. Reporters clustered near the exits, cameramen jostling for position. Staffers hurried to prepare talking points, phones buzzed with rapid text messages, and social media platforms were lighting up with clips of the exchange before either Kennedy or AOC had even left their seats. Inside the chamber, the two combatants rose almost simultaneously. Kennedy tucked his folder neatly under his arm, moving with the same quiet confidence he had shown throughout. AOC gathered her papers quickly, her movements sharper, more determined, as though preparing for the next battle before this one had fully ended. Neither looked at the other, but the silence between them spoke louder than words. The clash inside the hearing had ended. The war outside was just beginning. The chamber emptied slowly, but the story outside was already moving at lightning speed. Within minutes of recess, cable news chirons blared. Fiery clash, Kennedy versus AOC, in heated committee exchange. Clips of the interruption, Kennedy's measured response, AOC's raised voice, the reveal of the reports replayed on loop. America had just witnessed another political collision destined to outlive the hearing room. In Washington, perception often matters more than truth, and in this case, both sides claimed victory. Progressive commentators flooded social media with clips of AOC pressing Kennedy, praising her refusal to let bureaucratic complacency silence real-world suffering. Hashtags like hashtag AOC vs Kennedy and hashtag Fight for the People trended within an hour. To her supporters, interruptions weren't disrespect, they were defiance against a system. Too slow to answer urgent needs, conservative voices seized on Kennedy's quiet but devastating line, passion is not the enemy of truth, but passion without proof is theater. To them, that sentence defined the clash. Memes and posts hailed him as the steady hand against her theatrics. Spreading hashtags like hashtag Kennedy owned AOC and hashtag truth over theater, the media frenzy followed. One headline read, AOC interrupts, Kennedy retaliates with evidence. Another countered, Kennedy dismisses AOC's fire as theater. The divide wasn't just political, it was cultural. To half the nation, Kennedy was the defender of facts. To the other, AOC, the champion of raw, unfiltered urgency. Behind the cameras, both offices scrambled. Kennedy's staff clipped his calmest, most composed moments, feeding them to local stations to cement him as the elder statesman, facts in hand, unshaken by emotion. AOC's team doubled down on the interruptions, showcasing her insistence that real people are suffering while politicians shuffle papers. To them, Kennedy's reports symbolized bureaucracy hiding behind paperwork while ignoring pain. By nightfall, Clash had gone fully viral. TikTok edits dramatized the back and forth with bold captions. YouTube creators uploaded breakdowns of every line. Twitter X became a battlefield, each side convinced their champion had landed the decisive blow. But beyond the noise, one truth lingered. The hearing had shifted the entire debate. Policy details buried in reports no longer defined the issue. From now on, it was about credibility Kennedy's evidence versus AOC's passion. Every future mention of the matter would carry the shadow of that exchange, her fiery interruption, his calm pull of the folder. That evening, when asked if the moment helped his case, Kennedy replied with dry humor, "Well, if you're asking me whether facts still matter, I guess we'll find out." Across the city, AOC faced reporters with equal sharpness. When pressed about Kennedy's theater remark, she shot back, "If fighting for people is theater, then I'll take center stage every single day." The contrast was perfect for the cameras. One man leaning on evidence, one woman leaning on conviction. Neither surrendered an inch. By morning, the headlines weren't just about a committee clash. They captured something larger. A snapshot of America's divide framed in one unforgettable moment, AOC's fire versus Kennedy's facts.